Good morning, afternoon. Welcome to a special edition of the America Europe Fund's Transatlantic Lecture Series, hosted by the America Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation, and International Regulation. My name is Esther Zalin Adu, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. As you can see, we are hosting a full panel today, so I will skip my usual remarks and go straight to the heart of today's discussions, which center on the implications of the US Supreme Court's ruling in February, which invalidated President Trump's global tariff policy under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEEPA. To help us unpack the domestic and global implications of the ruling, we are joined by eminent scholars from across the globe. From the UK, but actually currently calling in from Rhode Island, we are joined by Meredith Crowley, who is a professor and deputy chair of the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge, fellow at St. John's College. Also from the UK, but calling in from Cape Town, South Africa, we have Ohio Emununu, who's an associate professor in international economic law at the University of Kent Law School, editor of afroeconomicslaw.org, and the director of its academic forum. Also in the US, calling from DC, we are joined by Miss Kelly Mayman-Hawk, who is a senior counselor at McLarty Associates and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Previously, she worked for the US Department of State and as director for Brazil and the Southern Cone at the Office of the US Trade Representatives. Also calling from DC, we have Mr. Alan Wolf, who's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Before joining the institute in 2021, he previously served as Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. And last but certainly not the least, we are joined by Nicolas Emperon from Chile, who's a professor of economics law and director at the Center for Law, Regulation, and Sustainable Economics at the School of Law, University of Valparaiso, Chile. And with that, I'd like to open the discussions and ask the panel, for our audience, could you briefly explain to us the legislative history of IEEPA and how it became the core of President Trump's global tariff policy in 2025? We start with Alan. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Esther. And it's a pleasure to be hosted by Leuven and by your great school of very long-standing, and be joining my fellow panelists. IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was enacted in 1977. It was the Congress was trying to cut back on the president's authority, oddly enough, because this had been largely the same language used in wartime in 1917, called the Trading with the Enemy Act. Trump came along, and it wasn't that he was enamored of IEEPA. He was enamored of tariffs and is still. So the president campaigned on putting on tariffs 10 to 20% across the board for the world and 60% for China. He first acted against Canada and Mexico and China and said it was because of fentanyl. They were not interdicting, they were not preventing exports of the flow of fentanyl to the United States. This was largely an excuse. There wasn't much coming in from Canada, for example. But nevertheless, he proclaimed tariffs in February of 2025, last year, on those three countries, additional tariffs. And he used IEEPA because all you have to do if you're president is declare an emergency, and then you have authority to regulate the importation, is the words of the statute, of imports. And famously, he stood in the Rose Garden holding tablets up showing tariffs on everybody from pretty much from around the world, from every country, at sort of fanciful large rates. Um, Declaring an emergency was not that unusual. There had been 77 of them declared before President Trump took office the second time. Um, the Supreme Court, as Esther has mentioned, on February 20th, struck down this use of the statute. It was done on a rather narrow basis. While they didn't like the idea that the president had the full tariff power of the United States because it's lodged in the Congress under our Constitution, uh, but they said, well, regulate importation doesn't say use tariffs, so the tariffs don't exist as an authority under this statute. Uh, the key point, the key takeaway is America had become a higher tariff country, going back to levels that were not seen since the early 1940s.
Thank
And I'll
you,
stop
Alan.
there.
Yes, thank you, Alan, for those remarks. Then, Kelly, I go to you. As Alan provided the legal context of our IEEPA, what is the political implications, especially on how he did it under the IEEPA, and especially based on Alan's analysis of the Supreme Court ruling? What is the political context that we also need to take into account?
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court ruling as a non-lawyer, it could not have been written more clearly. I mean, I'm looking at it right here. Held, IEEPA does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. I mean, it was literally written so fifth grader could understand it. And so I think that from a political standpoint, that's helpful because the inflationary impact of the tariffs throughout the United States was significant. And not only the inflationary impact, I'm from Nebraska, big soybean state. It also impacted a lot of our export markets, as we saw with China being one of the few countries to retaliate. Really, I think that's been one of the key discoveries, if you will, for the White House and for many voters in the United States is the amount of leverage that China actually has had through the various iterations of the IEEPA tariffs, over the first year of the second Trump administration. But I think that, the accessibility of the arguments was very important. And I think that that is politically important as well as we look at, what I call the IEEPA substitutes of the 122 tariffs that have been put in place, alleging a balance of payments crisis, as well as the new 301 investigations on structural excess capacity, as well as labor practices. I think that we can expect that those will also see some sort of legal challenge. The 122 tariffs already have two lawsuits against them with similar arguments. So watch this space.
Thank you, Kelly. And as Alan already gave us a good overview of the Supreme Court's ruling, I'll just go ahead and go to the next question. So, following the release of the Supreme Court's ruling, what were the initial reactions to the decision? As Alan already explained, America is essentially a high tariff country right now. Kelly also explained that they are still reusing some of the arguments on the IEPA under these new substitutes, especially on the Article 122. So we'll go to Meredith for initial reactions and then Kelly, Alan, then Nicholas, and Ohio.
Thanks very much. So building on what Alan and Kelly have already explained, I'll just talk a little bit about the perspective from countries outside the US. So I've been in Britain for over 10 years now, and I think it's a country that's been trying to navigate its position outside the European Union. It left the European Union initially in 2016 as a middle power country. And so its general thrust of policy has been trying to strengthen the World Trade Organization, actually, for the collection of middle power countries like Canada, Australia, Japan, and to some extent the European Union. Now, in response to these IEEPA changes, it's actually a bit of a mixed bag for Britain because on the one hand, their stance toward the United States since 2016 has been sort of agile responsiveness, and they've been trying as much as they can to always get a cooperative, productive, and pragmatic deal with the United States, and they would like a deeper economic relationship. The U.S. is the United Kingdom's top destination for exports. It's also the top destination for outward British investment, and Britain is the largest source of inward investment is the United States. So the IEEPA ruling is a bit, on the one hand, it solidifies US policy in a strong legal framework, which, in ruling that the tariffs were illegal, that comes down on the side of rule of law, which is welcome because certainty and predictability is good. That said, as Kelly mentioned, the president's gone into a new ream of tariffs, and potentially these could be much more worrisome for the United Kingdom. So first of all, um, just to say, as an economist, it's not possible for a country to have a balance of payments crisis if it does not maintain a fixed exchange rate. So the premise of the Section 122 tariffs to an economist appears just to be, frankly, nonsense. The Section 301 tariffs, though, are much more substantive and worrisome. So first of all, on the export of services side, Britain maintains a digital services tax, which is for all service providers in the United Kingdom, but it does have a negative impact on some large American technology firms. Its main exports on the good side to the United States are pharmaceuticals and cars. And the IEEPA ruling, since then, there's been a lot of uncertainty about future American policy on the importation of pharmaceuticals, what tariffs they will face. Britain is very worried about a higher tariff on pharmaceuticals. That's one of its premier industries. And they're also, to a lesser extent, perhaps, worried about future tariffs on automobiles. They thought they had secured a solid deal with the United States under the IEEPA framework, and now they're back, that is up in chaos. And so the main thing we know as economists, uncertainty and a lack of predictability about future policy reduces trade flows, it reduces investment flows, and creates a lot of, negative, costly uncertainty for business.
Thank you, Meredith. And Kelly, especially from your perspective, working in Brazil and also around the region, what were the initial reactions?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at not just in Latin America, but globally, there were a number of countries that had come to accords with the United States, either agreements, framework agreements, or the more formal agreements on reciprocal trade, what the administration calls ARTs. A number of those countries that had agreed to agreements on reciprocal trade are in the region. El Salvador was the first one. We also had Guatemala, Argentina, and then more recently, Ecuador, post-Supreme Court decision. They're the only one to have signed an ART so far, post-Supreme Court decision. And I think there was a bit of an inflection point of, gosh, why did we agree to this? If the leverage that was being applied on us was by virtue of the IEEPA tariffs, and the IEEPA tariffs are no longer on the table. That said, in this environment where a rules-based system feels like a distant memory and might makes right seems to be the flavor of the day, most countries in the region have decided that they will kind of try to fight to live another day. I think most countries are doing that, right? So even Malaysia, that has said that they view their agreement on reciprocal trade as being in doubt, has been a little fuzzy on that. So I think you're going to continue to see that be the strategy for the Americas. Certainly Brazil, you mentioned Brazil, where I served as a diplomat. And have spent a lot of time there. For Brazil, and I would say for all of the countries that were suffering under IEEPA tariffs that were not justified by trade deficits, but were justified under political, motivations. I'm thinking here of not just Brazil, but also India. The reaction was positive in that it did reduce that tariff burden. And of all of the types of US law that exist that the administration has and probably will continue to try to deploy to apply tariffs, the one kind of activity that is kind of taken off the table by the Supreme Court by their determination is this sort of deployment of tariff threats under IEEPA for geopolitical reasons. So think about Greenland. Think about some of the threats that have taken place over the course of this second Trump administration, or even in the first Trump administration. I participated in the USMCA renegotiation or the NAFTA renegotiation where they arrived on USMCA. Remember, President Trump tried to apply IEEPA then, right? And stronger voices in his cabinet prevailed, and he did not. But that motivation or that intention I think is very deep in the president's psyche, to threaten tariffs for geopolitical reasons. And that is really taken off the table. So I think there's a sigh of relief with respect to that.
Thank you. And before we go to a specific regional perspective, I wonder what are the macro implications, especially if you are someone sitting in Geneva at the World Trade Organization, for example. Alan, would you like to put, give us some remarks on this?
Thank you for that. What are we working with? The U.S., the president, is intent on keeping the tariffs. So that's the steady issue that everybody has to work around. And the kind of authorities he's moving towards are which is Section 301 ultimately, retaliatory authority, has very few guardrails in it. The Supreme Court found some in IEEPA. They will find, the courts will find limits in the use of balance of payments authority, has been pointed out. There is no balance of payments crisis, and there cannot be for the United States at this point. So it's nonsense, but it's nonsense since it's a statute that allows 150 days of tariffs before they go away. It's a bridge to get to other tariffs, and that's exactly what USTR is intent upon doing. We've just had a ministerial conference in Yaoundé, Cameroon, and the major topic of the day, you would have thought of a trade organization, a global trade organization, would have been the U.S. tariff and the reactions to it, which have been all of these non-MFN discriminatory deals, starting with the UK and the EU and Japan and others. Everyone, minus a few, such as Canada, among the larger countries, have gone to cut deals, and the EU said, "Well, we want our deal," because although it's not, it doesn't lack controversy in Brussels, but the fact of the matter is, the EU has said we want our deal, and Trump has said, "I want the deals to be maintained." So what is happening? The deals are being maintained. Now, does this destroy the world trading system? No, it doesn't. U.S. trade is 13% approximately of world trade. And so the U.S. and its bilaterally, others have cut out from the trading rules, from non-discrimination, from tariff bindings, the series of deals, but they are being maintained. They will be maintained unless something else comes along. If the Iran war isn't able to be resolved, that's going to cause some stress, because there are a lot of countries are suffering from the Strait of Hormuz being threatened and partially closed for a while, maybe closed again. So the willingness to go along with these deals might have other factors that come into the picture. But the fact is, the WTO is continuing. It has its own problems of reaching conclusions on investment facilitation for development, an agreement that's ready to be adopted, which isn't being adopted, on things like promising not to put tariffs on e-commerce, which they weren't able to agree on, a moratorium, which had been in effect since 1998. So the WTO continues to do or not do what it was on track to seek to accomplish. The world trading system has not collapsed. It continues. And the fact of the matter, straying into economics for a moment, not my area, supposedly, not my training, but the world settled in for a 10% or so tariff, maybe 10 or 15% tariff, the way it settled in for value-added taxes, tax on consumption, and went about its business. Trade continued. It's worse for the world economy. There'll be less growth than there would be otherwise. But the fact of the matter is, globally, the world went on its way. It's just going to become more difficult for a variety of reasons we'll probably get into later in this conversation.
Thank you, Alan. Then, from a regional perspective, I wonder, Nicholas, after we've discussed the domestic implications, some of the regional implications from the UK, the EU, and of course the macro at the WTO, what were the initial reactions, especially from Chile and the broader Mercosur community, for example?
Thank you, Esther, and thanks. I'm very happy to be joining this conversation. Yeah, so let me step back because I think that what we've seen in Latin America more generally is like it's more about what Trump has been doing, and IEEPA is more like a new episode, but I think it's important to take the whole picture. One of the things is that one of the first reactions when Trump started announcing a tariff, for instance, in Chile, the country that negotiated an FTA with the US early in the 2000s was, well, we are different, we are special because we have an FTA. So I think one of the first reaction was there was still a sense of that the rule of law would somehow prevail, that some sense would prevail that, abiding by treaties that were negotiated in detail and that were very important. And for Chile, it was a key moment in the history of, the country going back to democracy and the way it was cementing economic growth. So it was a bit of a moment of despair, if you want to. I think that continues, because Chile has been negotiating with the US some kind of deal that now there is a change of administration. But that sense that, that having an FTA should have some relevance, it's still, you can still hear that in the corridors. Though unfortunately it seems that it doesn't. So that's one of the things I would say. And my intuition is that you see similar things happening in countries like Costa Rica or Peru, or to some extent, maybe some people in Colombia think similarly. So that's one thing. People who have, countries that have FTAs, they still would like to make that have some influence. Then the other thing is that what you see in Latin America, I think Kelly already touched on that, is that politics has come back into the trade conversation very strongly, So, Argentina has signed a deal with the US, for instance, backtracking our IP position for political reasons that are more related to, the personal relationship between the two presidents. And of course, then you see what is happening in Brazil. And it's not so much about the economic relationship between Brazil and the US. It's more about, a particular dispute between different, the opposition leader in Brazil and his relationship with the US president. That I think that 15, 20 years ago, these were not the things that were a leading trade policy, but they are now. And I think these people are trying to get used to this new reality. And this is, of course, again, that what happened with the US Supreme Court and IEEPA, it is all part of that situation. And again, that Ecuador has signed a deal after the US Supreme Court decision. Again, you can understand that based on the personal relationship between the two leaders. But it's difficult. We are talking about this in terms of economics or trade policy, but it seems to be that it's a different kind of politics. And that I think that's part of, that people are trying to get to understand what's happening with that. Then something else I'd like to say is that when Trump started with the deal, with the tariffs and then trying to find deals, part of the policy approach was to rush to the US and try to get the best possible deal. And now this has changed. And you see that, people are taking more time about this and they're trying to get more of the general situation and what are the implications. So I think part of the initial reaction, of the IEEPA decision has to do that people are saying, okay, let's cool down and think about it, And that I think that is sort of with the taco tariffs effect, if you want to. But last, and probably not least, I would say, for many people in Latin America that are, were involved in negotiating these deals, are working in the missions in Geneva, are, teaching trade law. This is a moment of despair in the sense that the US was sort of, the main country that was defending free trade. Maybe the US was not a real free trader after all, but, politically speaking, a lot of support to these policies came from the US. And these people, I think they think they have lost their church, if you want to. They were going there, and speaking to a community that had like a sort of a similar understandings about how the world should operate, how the world economy should be ruled. And that is gone. And I think these people are feeling themselves a bit lost today. And these, I'm talking not about like the main political leaders, but very important diplomats and people in the, in the foreign offices that are wondering themselves what's next. And I think IEEPA is not, I mean, the decision of the US Supreme Court, and Alan mentioned that, is not finishing this series. Is actually, an episode. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicholas. So, moments of despair and rule by politics in trade policy. Ohio, your thoughts, especially from Africa.
Yes. I mean, even just the last point that, first and foremost, thank you for having me join this panel. I've really enjoyed the contribution so far. And I think the last point that Nicholas mentioned, I think it's a similar feeling in the conversations I've had with groups, especially in the run-up to MC14. There seemed to be this distraction and despair, the preoccupation with what the US was or was not doing, in many ways overshadowed what ordinarily should have been a very different dynamic in the run-up to the Yaoundé Ministerial Conference. So yes, we've had the similar kind of feedback. Then speaking about the African US African trade relations and how IEEPA impacts this. First and foremost, this comes with a caveat that obviously this does not represent some continental-wide position, because across the continent, I would say that the reactions to the Supreme Court ruling was quite varied, and in some instances, I would say muted. And this is because obviously largely US-African trade is still negligible. And if you even look at the dynamics in the immediate aftermath of the IEEPA tariffs being imposed, you would see that almost no African country was able to get a deal, not for lack of trying. South Africa obviously did try, but didn't get anything for some reasons that perhaps may not be able to discuss here. But basically, Africa seems, still marginal and peripheral in the context of its engagement with the African market. But I guess what's more important in terms of the significance of both the IEEPA tariffs as well as the Supreme Court decision is the timing, in the sense that it came at a time where one of the most important or significant modes of interaction between the US and African countries in the context of trade, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, was being discussed in the context of a potential 16 years renewal. But with a lot going on in the US domestically, that fell through the cracks, and it was allowed to elapse in September 2025. And so if you then match the time when the Liberation Day tariffs came in many ways, some countries were significantly impacted, such as South Africa, because of its automotive exports to the US market, Lesotho. So for South Africa, it was slapped with a 30% tariff. Now for Lesotho, in the textile and apparel sector, I mean, very small landlocked country on the African continent, but was slapped with a 50% tariff. And so in many ways, at sectoral and level, and for certain countries on the African continent, it was a major disruption because it coincided with the fact that, AGOA was not extended initially in September 2025. So in the intervening period, we then have the litigations, which, accumulated with the Supreme Court decision. So in that context, what's also interesting is that AGOA was then finally approved in a few days early, the first week of February, just before the Supreme Court decision. And so in many ways, yeah, that was like a little bit of a win, even though it was just extended to December 2026, with retroactive application back to September last year. But then with the renewal, a lot of commentators are basically saying this, before the reintroduction of AGOA or in terms of it's been signed to continue again, there were already conversations about how effective AGOA has been for African countries, but in many ways, it still remains the best bet to be able to, boost or catalyze African U.S. Trade relations. And so the fact that the pivot to Section 122 and the other legal mechanisms that the current administration is now using means that the AGOA regime and its potential benefits are effectively been hollowed out or neutralized by the existence of this very unpredictable as well as complicated back and forth as to the tariffs, and it's 10%, today it's 15%. So in many ways, it's very disruptive, and so it does not do any good for what is already not the most encouraging trade relations between the United States of America and African countries. Then the last thing I would add is that we then also need to take this, and I think this also links to what everyone else said as well, the politics and the optics as well. So we've had the inaugural speech of Nick Checkers, who is the senior bureau official in charge of U.S.-Africa relations. And when you look at the context of his speech, in many ways, it outlines the trajectory and the direction that the current administration is taking in the context of U.S.-Africa relations, where it's based on commercial diplomacy, supply chain security, especially around critical minerals. And so in many ways, I think for the African continent and countries on the African continent, it's a time where we need to be very cautious. We need to wait and watch because we need to see what kind of bilateral approaches we'll be getting from the U.S. administration and how that would shape. And this is important as well because on the African continent, one of the key things we've been trying to focus our energies on, giving, that boost to the African continental free trade area. So any distractions or fragmentations is not welcome. But we also know that it also has created a space where other geopolitical players such as China are kind of trying to, in many ways, exploit the gap that is being left with the fact that the US is now very unpredictable trading partner for African countries. So that's kind of like been the initial reaction to things.
Ohio, wait and watch, especially considering the unpredictability of current US-Africa relations. So with that, as it appears that there's a particular area that needs further analysis, one area of the ruling that was often overlooked but still questions is the validity of this series of US tariff deals with several US trade partners. For example, Meredith, Allen, and Kelly mentioned the deals with the EU, UK. I believe Nicholas also mentioned some of the series of deals that were pre-existing Trump, for example, the FTA with Chile. So what is a feature of this series of tariff deals that were made in 2025? We'll start with Alan, Kelly, and then Nicholas. What is their future?
Well, there is no international validity under any existing agreements. We, the United States, have violated our agreements, not only the WTO, but a series of free trade agreements to a very large extent. Although there's still the USMCA, which is the old NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is still being honored by the administration and saves this part of the continent of the Americas from total economic catastrophe. It's very bad, but it's not completely destroyed. The other countries, members of the WTO, have a perfect right to bring cases. And there's a problem with them, and that is that the U.S. doesn't honor on appeal any judgment from the WTO. So it's left binding dispute settlement behind. So no international validity. And as I said a little bit ago, it doesn't mean that the world trading system is completely undermined. despite the best efforts of the United States to do that, because the United States doesn't have really that much of world trade. It's a very rich market, and it does account for 13% of world trade, but it does not mean that other countries have deviated from their relations with each other than a violation of MFN, which is not minor, and I don't minimize that. As for the future, the U.S. has said that MFN is dead, most favored nation, or non-discrimination is dead, something of the past. It has not really proposed anything to replace it other than power relationships. And I think even more worrying, we know where the U.S. is coming from, is the trade commissioner of the EU, Maros Sefcovic, has said that MFN needs re-examination because of imbalances in the trading system, presumably referring it's in large part to China and its headlong effort to increase its exports, at which it's very successful and is a disruptive factor in the world trading system, since it is not switching its economy to greater domestic demand as compared with satisfying the domestic market and having more domestic investment rather than export promotion. So the system endures. The deals are invalid. I would say, as has been talked about by my colleagues on the panel, that they all recognize the United States is not without leverage, which continues. And it may be that you do things more slowly and see how things will work out. But no country has said to the United States that reached a deal, there's nothing we can do with you. Do your worst, because the president is quite able to do things that look a lot like the worst. So they don't take that option.
And Kelly?
Yeah, I think Alan's right that what countries that have agreements are doing is basically evaluating where they should implement and where they don't need to implement. And if you look at the agreements on reciprocal trade, one silver lining is that there are WTO disciplines that are reinforced within those agreements. If we're talking about technical barriers to trade, sanitary, phytosanitary standards, intellectual property rights. So I'm looking for silver linings because it's hard to get out of bed these days without them. I mean, that's a positive. But there are elements of the agreements I would highlight in particular the economic security and national security components that have very challenging obligations vis-a-vis Chinese involvement in economies. And this is not just a Latin America thing. This is across the board in the agreements on reciprocal trade. And they're hard enough for Latin America, where if you go to Chile and some mining communities, as Professor Nicholas knows, signs are in Chinese. I mean, we're a little bit, late to the party as far as, thinking that we can put these obligations on paper and they will be easy for our trading partners to implement, right? So I think that when you look at the more challenging aspects of the arts, you will see a slow walk. You will see a kind of reevaluation on what really needs to be done by certain countries, especially because the payoff for having an art, much like as Nicholas was talking about, the payoff for having a free trade agreement, if you're USMCA, absolutely, because you've gotten a carve out, right? And so that's very valuable. But if you're Korea, they didn't get a carve out. They've got an FTA. If you're Chile, they've got a carve out. They didn't get a carve out. So, the payoff for having an FTA, the payoff for having an art, where we see, I mean, if you just look at the 301s that were filed most recently, which again, Alan is 100% correct. Obviously, those are going to be sticky tariffs. They're going to be very hard to get rid of, as are the 232 national security inspired tariffs. If you just look only at the structural excess capacity 301, of the countries that are included, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, Korea, Taiwan, Bangladesh, Japan, they all have agreements with the US, with the Trump 2.0 Trump administration. They were not given special treatment with respect to that filing. That's before we even get to the labor one that includes 60 different markets, right? So it's very comprehensive. So, I think that the calculus is do what I must, not everything I said I'd do, and also diversify trade. And so we are seeing, I mean, the EU-Mercosur agreement, which, as a Brazil hand, I would always joke that my grandkids might see that approved. It goes into force May 1st, and that was hard. We see Canada sending its largest business delegation in history to Mexico City. We see them restarting their negotiations with India, restarting their negotiations with Mercosur. Those are long-term, ways, strategies for addressing the reality check that the United States has provided in saying that, we're not going to be the keepers of the global trading system right now. It's not a quick fix, but I think it's a significant trend. And what I'm seeing in the business sector is businesses thinking about, okay, well, if the US isn't going to be the center of trade liberalization and the driver of trade liberalization, where should I be doing business? Where are deals being done? And where can I operate in order to access foreign markets in an effective way? And I think it goes without saying that that was not the goal of the Trump administration.
Thank you. And Nicholas, your thoughts? What is the future? And I'm also going to join this together with the following question on whether we should foresee possible legal challenges, either domestically or even a slowing down of ratification, as has been hinted by Kelly's remarks.
Thanks, Esther. Yes. I think it's the million-dollar question. What's going to happen with all the sort of network of deals we have from FTAs to these recent reciprocal agreements, and what's going to be the role of the World Trade Organization? I mean, the word for lawyers, the word validity, and when you posed the question, I was thinking more in legal terms. Whether these are like legally binding or not, and what happens with that. But I mean, one of the things I think is important here is that as we discussed, the rule of law is not playing the role it used to play. I mean, for us, people who are trained in international economic law, we remember like Bob Haddock used to call the GATT the times of the diplomat's jurisprudence. This is not the diplomat's jurisprudence; it's sort of the rule of rule of power, if you want to call it, or it's kind of complicated, and we're still trying to grasp that. For me, a big difference between the World Trade Organization and free trade agreements and the reciprocal agreements, recent agreements, is that, again, the World Trade Organizations and FTAs, they were embedded in a particular way of looking about how the economy should work. Whereas today, I think for many people, although we see, I mean, as Kelly mentioned, reference to, I don't know, the TBT or the SPS agreement, we see more a sort of a transactional way of dealing. So we are just putting things on the table and like trading horses. I mean, there was certainly something of that when you are negotiating FTAs and the World Trade Organization agreements. But there was also a way of understanding how the economy, and perhaps I'm repeating myself, the world economy should be governed. And I think what I see in many quarters is a certain frustration that is not holding anymore. And so, I mean, the validity of the World Trade Organization in terms of politically speaking, I mean, there are still ministerial conferences, there's still some agreements being discussed, but more importantly, I think it's still a place where people gather and meet and have conversations, The sort of diplomatic dimension of the World Trade Organization is still alive, although it hasn't been very relevant when it comes to negotiations. Now, I want to say that there is a problem with the World Trade Organization, and maybe the US has some reason with that. I mean, this comes actually from the Obama administration, and it has to do with the validity, the political validity, which is the backlash to the sort of a very strong legalism that took hold of the World Trade Organization. I mean, certainty and predictability are very important, but governments need some space, some flexibility to implement certain legislation. And you could see that the US was a bit, for instance, I mean, World Trade appellate body members like to be called judges. But I mean, this is some kind of culture of legality that I think for certain people coming from trade policy was a bit like not so much welcome. So, I mean, I think it went from one extreme to the other, and that has kind of reduced the space of negotiation within the WTO. I mean, the appellate body is perhaps not a court or a tribunal. After all, if decisions need to be approved by the dispute settlement body, and I think that was a bit of a problem. So I guess that the validity of the very strong rule of law approach is under discussion, but not only by the US, maybe many other countries already have intuitions on that. Yeah, now we go to the other extreme, these very thin reciprocal agreements. And the problem of those is that when you negotiate those having on the table that there are tariffs, and then those tariffs are gone, then the quid pro quo of those agreements is undermined, and then you see what Malaysia did. And then, legally speaking, maybe, I mean, there's a discussion whether these agreements they're not treaties to start with, so can countries really like step back from them? Maybe they can, like that's a more public international law conversation. But from a transactional point of view, there is a quid pro quo. That quid pro quo is no longer there, so you withdraw. Now, I don't see a future of the world economy in terms of any kind of predictability if this is going to be based on transactions that keep happening every 1 or 2 years because domestic conditions change and the US has enough leverage, so it's going to keep having the conversation. Because that, to me, is a problem with these agreements, is that the US, regardless of what happens, with the validity of the authority and that the tariffs are relies on, is that the US can always come back and say, well, something has changed, so I want to renegotiate. And that is a concern of many negotiators and many diplomats, where this is an endless renegotiation thing. And these agreements, because the US is saying explicitly there's no dispute settlement, there's nothing of that. So what are really the mechanisms you have as a small, medium economy to enforce those agreements? Very little, very little. So the validity in those terms, I think it's being eroded, and it's very, very little on that.
And Ohio, I put it to you, as it's quite clear that, for example, Alan already prefaced that these are invalid, even if partners were to take this to the World Trade Organization with its current crisis at a dispute resolution system, it would go nowhere. So should we follow Malaysia's approach, for example, unilaterally invalidate the tariff agreement if, for example, the quid pro quo is no longer provides any benefits? Or do we nullify any trade agreements? For example, the US-DRC Rwanda trade agreement did have some market access obligations also inserted in that agreement. So what are your thoughts, Ohio?
Thank you for that question. In terms of the legality that Nicholas was referring to, I was recently in a meeting where the DG of the WTO, Conjoella, was speaking, and she said something. She said that the WTO secretariat is now kind of dominated by lawyers over and above economists, and it never used to be that way. So sometimes I guess the disciplinary emphasis or staffing sometimes plays a role in how things the kind of the leanings. But to your question, in terms of the legality, I guess perhaps maybe we should take a step back and look at the variations in the type of agreements. Some are framework agreements. You have the agreements on reciprocal trade, which are more kind of aligned to our kind of conventional understandings of this type of agreement. So in that context, the variety and the flexibility and variations across the different deals. I was going through something on the Council for Foreign Relations. It has this deal tracker, Trump deal tracker. So it gives you a very amazing bird's eye view of all the deals that have been signed, the kind of core elements and emphasis of these different deals. And that then links to the first legal question, which is, if the quid pro quo or the legal basis which led to the negotiation of these deals was the tariffs and the fact that if you agree to this or we agree to an agreement, you would avoid the tariffs that were slapping on you in the first place. Now, since the legal basis for those tariffs have now been rendered null and void by the Supreme Court, I guess the question would be then, does that now remove or in many ways invalidate the basis or premise for those agreements? But I guess the tricky part of it is that if you read through a lot of those agreements, tariffs at the end of the day was just simply an entry point to a wider components covered in these deals. So in that context, even though, yes, the legality or the premise under which they were agreed is invalidated by the Supreme Court's decision, we can still say that the agreements in many ways cover a wider spectrum of issues beyond just tariffs. And so in that context, it could be argued that legally they are still binding. But again, the caveat is that if you look at the variations, so like the EU, for instance, was very careful. If you look at some of the framing in the EU agreement, it's quite left deliberately flexible, obviously anticipating the uncertainties because of the litigation that was going on even at the time all these deals were being signed. But then if you look at the more kind of ironclad type agreement, so like the agreement on reciprocal trade, and as Kelly mentioned, the dangers or the kind of the red flags in those agreements around the economic security and national security elements. I mean, if you read the one for Malaysia, because everyone's wondering why did Malaysia rush out? The Malaysia agreement as well as the Cambodia have those very, very, and remember, this is all happening in a context of uneven power relations between the negotiators in terms of the leverage that the US had coming into those agreements. It is different for the kind of leverage that the EU would have had coming into such conversations. So in that context, you can imagine that in many ways they gave up a lot for a reduction in tariffs. And if you read a comment that was made in the immediate aftermath of the Malaysia agreement by the Malaysian Minister of Investment and Trade and Industry, he said, we cannot backtrack on what we've already agreed upon, but we want to review any clause that we see as unfair so we can renegotiate them. And so obviously the moment the Supreme Court decision came out, that was a trigger. Now, does that mean we will see a cascade of withdrawals across the board? I don't think so. Because if we look at some other agreements where they left it loose, deliberately loose, there is obviously the basis to go back to the table to renegotiate and have a further conversation. Now, from the domestic perspective, the other part of your question, obviously, I mean, the Capital Institute had this reports that talks about over 2,000 domestic disputes in the U.S. trade court. So definitely we anticipate that there will be lots of cases because even the fallout or the implications of the Supreme Court's decision for the IEEPA tariffs is still uncertain. Even in the dissenting opinion by Justice Kavanaugh, he made it very clear. It's a mess. How do we sort out the refunds by the Customs Authority? So there's going to be a lot of litigation domestically. But from the international perspective, I think it's going to be a case of, I mean, a lot of negotiators, I'm not a negotiator, I don't know how those things work, but I'm sure they were very aware of the uncertainty that in many ways characterized going into those negotiations. So I guess those who went in and rushed into those negotiations without really thinking about the wider implications might be thinking, have we given up a lot? Do we need to find a way to backtrack? But for those who left it deliberately loose, I guess it's just a case of, well, in the uncertainties, we'll find a way to use this to get back to the table for further deliberations or negotiations.
Thank you, Ohio. As it's very clear that we can talk about the legality for hours, I think it's best we move on to some of the immediate economic effects and policy implications of decisions in terms of market sentiments in the US and internationally. So I'll put it to Meredith. Did it improve confidence in US institutions or further entrenches uncertainty and market volatility?
So I think the immediate not just the IEEPA decision, but also the response of the administration to introduce a balance of payments tariffs with, as Alan pointed out, could be a bridge to future 301 tariffs. This restated that the US on the trade policy side is going for uncertainty and a little bit of chaos. And just to be absolutely clear, I want to push back against one of the points Alan's made where he said a few times the US is 13% of global trade. That's absolutely true, 100%. But the US plays, as Nicholas pointed out, a disproportionate role in the global economy and has for 70 years. And this broke in 2018. And this is extremely worrying, not only for the growth consequences of the United States, but the growth consequences of people globally. And so I just want to state, very clearly in terms of the economic impacts, we know the US was the leader of a sort of movement for open liberal markets, low regulation, transparency. These fight against corruption and they fight against, a declining growth paradigm. And so there is a lot of validity to the neoliberal movement, which sought to open markets and give people human dignity through work and through economic opportunity. And so what the US has done over the last, sort of 10 years, which is very harmful for global economic prospects to people everywhere, is in response to a very real and legitimate concern with the WTO. Nicholas pointed out the US, the WTO became the domain of a legal, was dominated by a legal culture, which created rigidity in economic trade policy. And that was, frankly, not in the US's best interest. And it was something they sought to change. And they'd been unsuccessful at redirecting the WTO toward economic changes that they thought would be more in their favor. But the consequence, what we have in American policy now, let me back up. What we got when China joined the WTO was the US gave China economic policy certainty and access to the world's largest and deepest market. This led to, in just the first 5 to 8 years of China's WTO participation, a 30% increase in China's exports to the United States. 30% of the exports were caused by the reduction in uncertainty. 40% of new exporters entering the United States from China were able to do it because of the predictability and certainty that the WTO rules gave to Chinese exporters, private agents acting. And so when Ohio speaks of the unpredictability and uncertainty about AGOA, right? So this is quite important that the US repeatedly allows sub-Saharan African access to the United States market to close up and lapse. So if you are an exporter in Lesotho and you're trying to build your economy on getting people into jobs where they're producing apparel, and the US lets the agreement with Lesotho lapse, well then, you don't know what the future tariffs are. And so you don't want to make the investment. If you're a US multinational, if you're a German multinational, if you're a Chinese multinational, and you want to invest in sub-Saharan Africa to give them better access to global markets where they're rich consumers, it's just very difficult when these policies are changed. Now, the problems with AGOA well precede, the last 10 years of policy. But this is very, very important that the hyperbolic jumping from right to left all over the place, the chaos of the Trump administration causes real economic harm to people around the world. And it would be fine in some sense. Like I'll echo one of the points Alan made. The world can settle with a 10% US tariff. It would be fine in some sense if the US would go back to the WTO and say, we want an across the board 10% tariff. This is going to restrict access for some people. It's going to change things. But predictability over a long term, over say a 20-year horizon, would give more opportunity for planning, investment, and that in turn can lead to growth. Now, I'm not saying a 10% tariff on a permanent basis wouldn't harm many exporters to the United States. It would. It would cause an increase in the price level of the United States, which Americans have already, as Kelly pointed out, have borne over the last 5 years. The price levels are gone up. It's incontrovertible. And so, at some level, what we need out of, the economic consequences of the chaos have been high. And going forward, it's very hard for the rest of the world to navigate and create a world without US leadership, because the US intellectually has been the leader of a policy that has been very beneficial globally, not just with direct relations with countries, but also as a sort of bedrock upon which countries create their relations with one another. And so getting a little polemical here, but It's just to say economic consequences or chaos are real. And to go forward, what we need to think about is how do we think about what the US deeply wants and how can we create some policies to bring them back and to allow those in the United States who still favor transparent, open markets to come to a sort of, agreement with those. Nicholas said people, around the world who are supporting open markets feel a little lost because that liberal impulse is kind of it's present all across Europe, all across, Britain, all across sub-Saharan Africa. There are people who want open liberal markets. It's very hard for them to advocate for that and to continue to build that world without US leadership and support.
Alan, your response, Meredith mentioned that without the US support, that the cost is very high, especially if for those who believe in open, free, and liberal global trade system.
Yeah, I'd say, first of all, 100% agreement with what Meredith said. And when I said that the US is only 13% of world trade, talking in terms of the legal structure of the system, that no one is following the US example of saying, in our dealings with each other, outside of our dealings with the US, we're going to use a power-based system, not MFN, not non-discrimination, we're going to ignore all of our prior commitments. No other government is saying our past obligations are something we're not going to pay any attention to. Now, that doesn't mean that the U.S. chaos it brings about doesn't have an economic effect. I don't feel that way at all. There are some green shoots of something good happening. I think that at Yaoundé, at the Ministerial Conference number 14 of the WTO, 66 countries came together and said, we're going to have an agreement on e-commerce. And it's a good agreement. You, India or Turkey or South Africa or any of you who don't agree with it, don't come along, but we're going to do it. We're not asking your permission. And that is a breakthrough towards pragmatism that I salute, that I think is very important. What are they looking for? Rules. And actually, the U.S. will align itself with most of what's in the e-commerce agreement as well. So it's not, as a matter of fact, the U.S. has to go along with much of the system. And as has been said earlier, it's not saying, well, we're no longer going to agree that the standards agreement is something we'll live up to. So the U.S. has said we're going to be free on tariffs. We're going to be free on retaliation. We're going to be free on discrimination, and it will be damaging. But it is not the future, I think, of the world trading system, nor is it the future of where U.S. will be. Why? Because businessmen do crave certainty, because businessmen do crave an absence of chaos, because consumers don't want to pay extra for trade, and small businesses are particularly adversely affected by the uncertainty and by the tariffs, although large businesses are affected as well. So, what's the future look like? If I could move to that for a second, and that is that there isn't a party in the political party in the United States that's a high tariff party. Trump has given tariffs a bad name. I don't think there's a Republican Party or a Democratic Party that is post-Trump. We're going to campaign on having lots of tariffs of all sorts. And that is a change in terms of prior U.S. history over 100, 150 years, when there have been movements in favor of higher tariffs. Efficiency is a strong motivator. I mean, the laws of economics haven't been repealed. Businesses want to be able to acquire inputs for what they're producing from around the world, and so do consumers. So I think the U.S. comes back. I'm optimistic that in the long run, what was created by those who came out of World War II, a system of rules of law that will govern trade without being excessively legalistic. I think it went astray. I agree with that. That has been said by Nicholas. Uh, the WTO will actually will endure. The U.S. will eventually be part of it. I look for what we're seeing now is as a practical matter, those who are trying to find certainty in diversification of their sourcing. Countries are, there's been a stream of visits to New Delhi and to Beijing and other parts of the world to try to find greater certainty. I, for one, am optimistic that the world trading system will ultimately be improved, will prevail. We'll have the U.S. back in it. And whether it can become as efficient as we would like it, or some of us would, who are observers of the system, would like it. That's an open question. But in the long run, I think what was put into place to bring the world back from the devastation of World War II is the system that's going to prevail.
Thank you, Alan. And Kelly, as Meredith already prefaced some of these immediate economic effects of the decision, and Alan hinted that eventually the US will be back, what is your opinion as we enter this post-IEEPA era, especially in the medium to long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think this will echo some of what Alan said, but I mean, I think the buckets of activity that I see going forward are, yes, plurilaterals, and in addition to the 66 e-commerce group that we saw coming out of Cameroon, another meeting, and this goes more to the second bucket, which is diversification of trade, which I referenced in my previous comments, but I thought it was interesting that in Cameroon we saw the Comprehensive Progressive Trade-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP countries meeting with the EU. I think that those conversations are likely to deepen, and I think that's an interesting kind of space in that diversification effort to watch. Obviously, as Alan also said, continued outreach to diverse capitals, right, including Beijing, Delhi, and other major capitals. I think as far as the US coming back, I mean, I think our politics right now in the United States, and we're obviously in a midterm era right now. So a lot of this is being discussed and talked about at the local and state level, not just here in Washington. While I agree that you don't really have either Democrats or Republicans supporting blanket tariffs, as sometimes was the case in previous campaigns. I think that Trump has kind of done in a lab with his tariff policy what a lot of players certainly on the left, thought they wanted, right? Which was increase the tariff walls. That's going to, increase productivity, manufacturing here in the U.S. Well, that has proven false, right, by what we've seen happen, certainly during Trump 2.0. So what I think might happen is a bit of a more nuanced discussion around tariffs politically. I think most voters don't know what MFN is, but I think that most voters don't feel like the way we've been applying tariffs is fair. I think the reciprocity point around MFN that came through in the US proposal for Cameroon as well as the EU, I think that resonates with a lot of Americans and thinking, gosh, should we be charging a 2.5% tariff on automobiles at a time when China makes a really good EV for less than $10,000? Probably not. So should we look at the way that we're applying tariffs and key that more to, where we are productive, where we need inputs? I tend to talk not about imports, but inputs to US production, which is not just manufacturing, but it's also services, AI, farming, ranching, so I think having a more thoughtful political discussion over tariffs in the United States, now that we have people's attention, because typically, having worked on a bunch of campaigns over the years, the trade and tariff people are kind of stuck in a corner because we're the nerdy ones that are talking about things that voters don't care about. Voters kind of care about this stuff now because it's impacting their wallets. So I think, does that, what I think will be interesting to watch is, does that create a political space for some conversations on what we want to be as a trading country going forward? It won't be messy, or it won't be neat. It will be messy, and it won't be fast. But I think it's a reckoning that I think we need to have here in the United States.
Nicholas, as you heard from Kelly and Alan, Kelly mentioned that it will provide incentive for more thoughtful discussion on trade. Alan mentioned that the new playbook is certainty to true diversity. What are your thoughts? What could be the medium to long-term implications of this decision as we enter this post-IEEPA era?
Thanks, Esther. So first, I'd like to echo what Kelly said about the CTTPP EU discussions. I think there is a lot of that's going to be very interesting. Also, as the EU is trying to cement a position with other countries. So the sort of EU, Japan, Australia, Canada group of countries as trying to balance what the US has been doing, and at the same time trying to address China. So it's going to be interesting. But I'd like to talk more about what's next for the sort of small and middle economies. I think I'm very happy to see how this question of what's going to be the backbone of the global economy was of interest of the panel, and who's going to try to set the rules and try to support them in the future. So I think small and middle economies have a lot. They need to do a lot to promote this. I mean, there's one of the questions here about what they should be doing in terms of coordination, and I think something that we didn't see so far is they coordinating vis-a-vis the US and the sort of increase in tariffs, but something that's certainly something that they should be doing looking forward. I think a good legacy of the Doha round was how agile some emerging economies and small and middle economies too were in creating coalitions and coordinating their positions in the WTO negotiations. I think going back to that is very important for the future of world trade policy. I think it's important that different economies have the agility and the capacity to coordinate when they have a common interest. In this case, for instance, vis-a-vis the US, but it could be vis-a-vis China or the EU. I mean, small and middle economies have a lot to gain out of trade, but sometimes they're also in the losing position. For instance, when it comes to, let's say, I don't know, agricultural subsidies or things like this that hit badly the possibilities or the potential of some developing countries. So I think that as developing countries, small and middle economies, they need to play a more active role, and because they cannot do it individually, they need to find the ways to articulate their positions better through coalitions and coordinations. They did very well throughout the Doha round. In a way, a problem of the FTAs is that they killed that capacity. I can see why, the position of some large emerging economies was a bit of a problem, and why the largest economies wanted to go bilateral through the FTAs. But there was certainly a value added in economies that had common interests, getting together and articulating those and putting those very clearly in the negotiating table. So hopefully a bit of that, I think, will do well to the world economy.
And Ohio, your thoughts? Agility, capacity, and coordination. Could that be Africa, especially that it's on its way to forming the largest free trade area in the world?
Oh, agility. I've heard one of the questions in the Q&A around coordination in the context of Global South, but not to get into that yet. Coordination, I hope there is coordination from the African perspective. Now, coordination should be, in my estimation, around two major points. Number one, inward, given impetus and to the AFCFTA. Because in the context of Africa, US trade relations, it's struggled. Now, what we're seeing is more of a shift with China becoming a more significant player in that context. And we are also seeing, for instance, Beijing announced that it will be offering 0% tariffs. Tariffs are really popular these days to 53 African countries starting from May. So we see again this political strategic posturing from significant geopolitical heavyweights. And I think that that would be something that Africa needs to be very careful. They shouldn't get distracted. Oh, well, it seems it's not working with the US. Let's shift towards China. They should look inwards. They need to build their internal capacity. So that's the first thing that I think is important from an African perspective. Then, secondly, in terms of coordination, I think that Africa, and I remember saying this during the MC14 meetings, one of the meetings I went to, that look, there's been talk about the rise of middle powers. Now, this in itself is not new. If you go back to the 80s, and this was not in the context of trade, I remember a Nigerian, I'm from Nigeria, and so Nigeria's then foreign minister, Bolaji Akinyemi, pushed for, middle powers, taking, the reins to kind of, there was the Lagos Forum in the late 80s. So this whole conversation about middle powers rising to the occasion is not new. But and in this context, I do agree with what's been said by my other panelists that I don't think that the US is going to disappear. It's not a bump in the road. I don't think even after this current administration is no longer in office that we're going to perhaps go to the status quo before this. But I think we need to start to anticipate and prepare for what that world looks like, because if anything, what we've learned from this is that there's this theory, hegemonic stability theory, where a regime is built on the whims and caprices of one or two or more hegemons. It's dangerous because when those hegemons withdraw their support for the regime or the system suddenly becomes almost illegitimized, which is wrong. And so in many ways, we need to really return to some of those conversations around the middle powers really taking up a more significant role in terms of coordination at multilateral level. And finally, with respect to AGOA, and I do agree with what Meredith was saying. With AGOA, and I know there are a lot of conversations around special and differential treatment, the fact that it should not become the preoccupation. And in fact, if you look at the speech of Nick Checkers from the US, he was saying, look, it's trade, not aid. And personally, I feel that AGOA was never meant to be the end in itself or a means to an end. And so I think that the revisiting the conversations about reimagining AGOA, which has bipartisan support in the US Congress, is very important. And then in doing so, African countries need to, make sure we don't make the same kind of mistakes we had with the EU around the EPAs, because we need to make sure that it's something that works, not just for the US, but works for African countries as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Meredith, your final thoughts. Could this be the moment for middle powers like the UK to step up?
Sorry. Certainly there's a continued role for middle powers to step up and I think try to carry the torch of, open liberal markets during this period of, chaos in the United States. One hopes that, in the coming years, we can remain optimistic like Alan's encouraged us to, because we can hope that, the long run trend of US policy continues to be open, liberal, transparent markets are better for growth, and those should be supported. And in this interim, I think the question is how do we keep that thrust of policy alive? There is a role for middle powers, but in some sense, it's difficult because the world is still very reliant on the United States. And just a couple other, points. In 2015, so for a long time, about 70% of all British imports from outside the EU are invoiced in US dollars. Back in 2015, only about 37% of British exports to the globe were invoiced in US dollars. A lot was invoiced in pound sterling. Today, as of last year, the share of British exports invoiced in dollars has risen to 58%. So this is just to say, the global payment system is largely defined by the US dollar. All of Europe is reliant on large US payments providers to clear payments across European countries in euro. And so even if we separate, the US's role in trade, the US has other important economic roles to play. And so, it's very hard for other countries to fully take on that leadership. I think the intermediate step try to build out the plurilaterals, as Kelly and Alan both, spoke of, the e-commerce agreement, other plurilaterals where middle income countries, coalitions like CPTPP countries in the EU can try to define some of the, long-term goals of policy with a hope that, in some future, the United States will be invigorated to come back down on this. And at the same time, the political reality in the United States, consumers like low prices. And at some level within both parties, there's, concern about trade, about U.S. exposure to too much low-wage country trade. But there is a way forward for the U.S. to re-engage with the multilateral system. There's many different paths it could follow. At some extreme level, there can always be a renegotiation of the U.S.'s tariff position. And that would be something that's feasible. It's just not something that the U.S. has been particularly interested in pursuing.
Thank you, Meredith. The US will not disappear as it's currently still the backbone of the global economic system, as mentioned by Meredith. It is literally the way we pay our goods each and every day. So the future could be the role of coalitions or US engagement with the global economic order. And with that, we just have a few minutes for a brief Q&A. So I'll just go ahead and answer a question that was given by Gustavo Müller, who says, why haven't countries in the global South, Africa or Latin America coordinated their reaction to the US imposition of tariffs? Instead, they have all fallen back into asymmetrical bilateral negotiations. Even the EU has negotiated on its own with little coordination at all. Who would like to answer this question?
I mean,
I
I've
can
got an
give
opinion.
two
I mean, I think,
cents.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
No,
No,
you go, Nicholas. Start.
no, please get very, very quickly. I think in Latin America, unfortunately, government, ideologies when it comes to, politics play a very important role. So it's very difficult for countries to coordinate when they're not in the same, let's say, the same political sign. And that is a bit of a problem. I think that the way politics has got into trade discussions, it's problematic. I think some of the politics probably are necessary, the politics of climate change, the politics of worker rights, the politics of human rights, but not the politics of geopolitics and confrontation. And that is the kind of politics that got into trade. So that is certainly a problem. The other one, I think, is the lack of platforms where these countries can meet and negotiate and coordinate. So I think that it's let's say small and medium economies, particularly in Latin America, I think they're in debt in the sense that they have not created for themselves a platform where they can meet and negotiate and discuss common interests. And sometimes even, opposing political parties, but they could probably have common interests as they definitely do when it comes to, let's say, critical minerals. But that's very difficult when you have an administration that is, let's say, progressing and one that is not. And that, I think, is a problem. You see, Europe has managed to do that, but Latin America, unfortunately, has not.
And I think that goes beyond Latin America. I mean, I think just the fact that there's not a mechanism for regional coordination. And we saw that certainly going back to the free trade area of the Americas, which I wasted years of my life on. But even during CPTPP, those negotiations, and we just didn't see Southeast Asia coming together and saying, this is what we need. And Ohio would know better. But I mean, there's really not a platform for Africa either. I think that's one dynamic. I think the other dynamic is, it's, the theory of if you're on a hike with your friend and a bear comes along, you don't have to run faster than the bear. You just have to run faster than your friend. In other words, thinking that they can get a better deal, that countries can get a better deal for themselves. And they're all competing, right? And, the fact is companies have been trying to diversify away from China for a very long time. It's not just because it's politically fashionable now. It was for economic reasons in great measure. And so the countries, I'm thinking primarily of Southeast Asia here, were competing against each other, right, to be able to be the next venue. And Vietnam was a big winner, but other countries have significant participation in that diversification effort as well. So, there's more of a view of we're viewing each other as competitors, right? And so I think that dynamic comes into play as well.
Okay.
And I'll just quickly a few words. So number one, I think it's a case of, especially from the African perspective, I agree with Kelly and Nicholas about lack of platforms. Now, I think there is the potential for the AFCFTA to be a rallying point for Africa in terms of its in the way it coordinates against this kind of shocks from the other parts of the world. But as Kelly rightly mentioned, it's a case of self-interest, which in many ways fuels or gives impetus to this fragmented approach that we have with African countries and the way they engage with partners outside. I mean, so for instance, during the AFCFTA negotiations, during the Trump first term, at that same time, the US was negotiating an FTA with Kenya. And I mean, that was very inimical and in many ways contrary to what the African continent was trying to achieve. And so that kind of, divided approach where you approach separately and you are offered something and then you then look at what's in it for you is usually the major impetus for this kind of division. And so secondly, third, we need to remember that we are dealing in a situation of asymmetrical power relations here. So a lot of these countries, most times, just leverage they have, against them. But I think that African countries, for instance, need to think about their comparative advantage and realize what do they have, and they should bring that to the table. But more so, they should do so by first and foremost forging common positions. So it's possible. They've not done it in the past, so I'm not very optimistic, but it's possible.
Can I just add one little point, and that is the way this all unfolded is the UK and the EU caved. And so it wasn't as if there was a model out there of we have to, and they did for their own reasons. I mean, every country, I mean, every of the large players, Japan as well, said, what's our relationship with the U.S.? What do we need the U.S. for? Other things than simply the tariff. So. If you look out and the large players are succumbing, it's more difficult for the smaller players to say, let's all unite and have a different point of view.
Thank you, Alan. It is possible, but the large players may not have a role. And with that, I'd like to leave it there as we've approached the end of today's discussion. I would like to first thank our guests, Professor Meredith Crowley, Professor Ohio Aminu, Professor Nicholas Emperone, Miss Kelly Mayman-Hawk, and Mr. Alan Wolf for their insightful remarks in this special edition of AAF's Transatlantic Lecture Series. And thank you, our audience, for your participation. To remain updated on future AF initiatives, look no further, as we are pleased to announce that we are teaming up with a new academic network focused on transatlantic relations, a Jean Monnet network called TANDEM, which stands for Transatlantic Network for Dialogue, Education, and Multidisciplinary Research, bringing together 20 higher education institutions from Europe and North America, where over the next 3 years, the network will facilitate dialogue such as this, exchanges amongst experts in transatlantic relations in a variety of fields and disciplines, from trade, green economy to peace and democracy. It will produce webinars such as these, podcasts, as well as policy briefs and much more. The first of its conference will take place in Washington, D.C. from the 15th to 17th October, titled the Transatlantic Relations Recalibration or Irrelevant. So if you are interested in joining us, please do not hesitate to visit Tandem's website, which is tandem-jeanmonnet.eu, or send us an email at tandem@kleuven.be. With that, I'd like to thank again our guests for their insightful remarks. This is probably one of the best conversations I've had this year. So I really look forward to future output from your scholarship and expertise, especially on this evolving debate. And thank you, our audience. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you.
Thank you.